June 23, 1944. The Atlantic Ocean was silent that night, a silence so deep it almost felt alive. Far from any coastline, a massive Japanese submarine known as I-52 moved slowly beneath the dark surface. Inside, the air was thick, the crew tired but proud. They believed they were untouchable, protected by miles of open ocean and the cloak of night. Commander Uno Kameo, standing in the narrow control room, stared into the dim glow of his instruments. His mission was secret, his cargo priceless. 2 tons of gold, over 100 tons of tin and other valuable materials bound for Germany. The war had turned desperate, and this voyage was meant to strengthen Japan's alliance with its Axis partner. Above the waves, the world was asleep. Below them, men worked quietly, confident that no enemy could possibly find them in such a vast sea. But that night, something invisible was listening. 3 hours later, the I-52 would vanish, destroyed by a weapon no one on board had ever heard of. The sounds of their final moments would echo through the water, caught by strange floating devices dropped from American aircraft high above. Those small machines, called Sonar Buoys, or Sonar Buoys, would change naval warfare forever. What seemed like an ordinary night patrol became a turning point that made Japanese commanders realize a horrifying truth. The ocean was no longer theirs. In the early years of the war, Japan's submarines had been symbols of pride and power. They were among the largest and most advanced in the world, some even capable of carrying aircraft. Their engineers had built them to travel around the globe without refueling, to strike anywhere, anytime. Japanese sailors believed the sea was their domain, a vast empire beneath the waves. But by mid-1944, something had changed. America's factories, scientists, and engineers had quietly built tools that turned the ocean into a battlefield of sound. What once hid submarines now betrayed them, and what once gave Japan confidence now brought only fear. For the men of I-52, that revelation came too late. Their story isn't just about one submarine sinking. It's about how technology itself became the deadliest weapon of all. This is how the ocean that once carried Japan's power became its grave. The night before disaster, the I-52 had made contact with a German submarine, the U-530. Far out in the Atlantic darkness, 2 Allied vessels met in secret. The sea was calm, the sky completely black. They exchanged radar equipment, spare parts, and 2 German technicians who would travel aboard the Japanese vessel to Europe. The meeting went perfectly. Commander Kameo felt relieved. His mission seemed to be going exactly as planned. He ordered the crew to continue west toward France, traveling just below the surface to avoid Allied aircraft. Inside the submarine, men talked quietly, unaware that this would be their last night alive. Some were writing letters, others checking instruments or resting near the narrow corridors. No one imagined that death was already waiting, not in the form of a ship or a torpedo they could see, but something invisible drifting on the water's surface. A few hundred miles away, American forces were hunting. On the deck of the escort carrier USS Bogue, radar screens flickered with faint signals. One of the Avenger bombers, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Jesse Taylor, picked up a contact that shouldn't have been there, a large vessel moving fast and deep in the night. Taylor's aircraft descended through the clouds. Below him, a dark shape glided just under the surface, the I-52. He knew what he was looking at, and he had new weapons the enemy didn't yet understand. He released a flare, bright as daylight, that lit up the sea for miles. The Japanese crew panicked. Orders were shouted. Engines roared. The submarine began an emergency dive. Taylor's bomber released a series of depth charges that exploded all around the descending vessel. The water shook violently, lights flickered, but the submarine survived the first attack. The crew thought they had escaped. They were wrong. Taylor then deployed a new device, a small floating cylinder known as a Sonar Buoy. It looked harmless, just a metal tube bobbing in the waves, but inside it was a microphone that could hear underwater. Every sound, every turn of a propeller, every echo of machinery, was sent by radio straight back to Taylor's aircraft above. For the first time in history, a submarine hiding in the deep was no longer invisible. The Americans could now listen through the ocean itself. Within moments, Taylor's radio operator began to hear a slow, rhythmic pulse. Propellers, moving east. It was I-52, Taylor followed the sound. Every time the submarine tried to change direction, the sonobuoy tracked it. The hunter now had eyes beneath the surface. Taylor dropped another weapon, the Mark 24 acoustic torpedo nicknamed Fido. Unlike normal torpedoes, this one didn't need to be aimed by sight. It listened for sound, the spinning of a submarine's propellers, and guided itself toward the noise. Minutes later, deep beneath the Atlantic, the crew of I-52 heard a faint whine growing louder. Some thought it was a malfunction. Then came the explosion. The entire submarine shuddered violently. The lights went out, and water rushed in through ruptured metal. The I-52 sank quickly, carrying 94 crew members, 14 passengers, and 2 German engineers down to the seafloor, nearly 17,000 feet below. Above, the sonobuoys recorded everything: the explosions, the hull collapsing, the ocean swallowing the last traces of the submarine. That recording would later be studied by American engineers. For the Japanese Navy, it was the first terrifying sign that something had changed forever. When the I-52 failed to arrive in France, silence followed. No distress calls, no signals, just disappearance. Weeks passed and the Japanese Navy quietly removed her name from active duty lists. But inside Naval Command, confusion spread. Commander after commander demanded answers. How could a massive submarine vanish without warning? The Atlantic was deep, yes, but not endless. And if enemy ships or aircraft had attacked, there should have been some clue: wreckage, oil, or radio messages. Yet there was nothing. Rumors began to move through the fleet. Some said the Germans had betrayed the mission. Others whispered that the Americans had discovered a new kind of weapon, one that could see underwater. At first, no one believed it. But as more submarines failed to return, disbelief turned into fear. By mid-1944, Japanese submarine crews were beginning to notice something strange. Whenever they surfaced, enemy planes appeared almost instantly, even in places thought to be safe. When they dived to hide, the attack still came, hitting with impossible precision. It was as if the Americans could sense them, hear them, even through miles of seawater. And in truth, they could. The secret was out: the sonobuoy, a floating ear that allowed U.S. aircraft to listen for submarines hidden below. What began as an experiment had become one of the deadliest systems in the war. For the Japanese, this changed everything. Their submarines, once the silent predators of the sea, had become the hunted. Every dive was a risk. Every movement might give them away. Before the war, Japan's submarines had been their pride. They were huge, beautifully built machines, strong enough to travel around the world, capable of carrying aircraft or cargo. Crews were hand-picked, trained for years in stealth and discipline. They believed their engineering could match anyone's. But war doesn't reward pride. It rewards production and innovation. And America had both. While Japan built a few giant submarines, America built hundreds of smaller ones, faster, simpler, and equipped with the newest sonar and radar. Every month, new technologies appeared. Radar that could detect ships over the horizon, sonar that could paint pictures of the ocean floor, torpedoes that could home in on sound. Japanese submarines, even with their impressive size, simply couldn't keep up. For the men who served on those submarines, the realization came slowly, like watching the tide turn. They started each patrol full of confidence, believing in their vessels and their commanders. But with each mission, they saw more of their friends disappear. Entire crews vanished without a trace, sunk by enemies they never even saw. One officer later said that the ocean itself began to feel hostile, not just the enemy above it. He described hearing distant explosions under the water, never knowing which side had caused them. It was as if the sea, once Japan's greatest ally, had changed sides. The loss of the I-52 wasn't just another ship gone, it was the start of a new kind of fear. A fear that no amount of bravery or training could defeat, because bravery cannot hide you from technology. From that moment on, Japanese sailors began to understand the Americans were not simply stronger. They were listening, and in a war of silence and sound, that meant the ocean no longer belonged to Japan. The loss of the I-52 wasn't just another ship gone. It was the start of a new kind of fear, a fear that no amount of bravery or training could defeat, because bravery cannot hide you from technology. From that moment on, Japanese sailors began to understand. The Americans were not simply stronger. They were listening, And in a war of silence and sound, that meant the ocean no longer belonged to Japan. The difference between Japan and America in World War II was more than strategy. It was technology, and the speed at which each side could create it. Japan had engineers who built beautiful machines, strong, complex, and carefully designed. But America had something even more powerful: mass production and innovation at scale. Every few months, American scientists introduced something new: faster radar, smarter torpedoes, clearer sonar. Factories across the United States worked day and night, turning ideas into weapons before Japan could even react. While Japanese submarines were built one by one, American submarines were built by the hundreds. They rolled out of shipyards like cars from an assembly line, identical, efficient, and ready for war. Japan's submarines were giants of the ocean. Some could carry aircraft in sealed hangars and launch them into the sky. Their range was incredible, long enough to circle the world. On paper, they looked unstoppable. But in war, size doesn't always mean power. The bigger the submarine, the louder it was underwater. Its engines, its propellers, even the metal plates of its hull, they all made noise. And noise was death in a world where America had learned to listen. The Americans had created a system of underwater ears, sonar networks, radar-equipped aircraft, and submarines armed with sound-guided torpedoes. Every part of the ocean became a grid, carefully watched. There was no place left to hide. In the air, American pilots used Sonar Buoys to hunt submarines. On the water, destroyers carried depth charges that could be dropped with deadly accuracy. And below the surface, American submarines patrolled trade routes, striking Japan's supply ships again and again. Each time a Japanese submarine tried to attack, it risked being detected. Each time it tried to escape, the enemy was already waiting. In Japan, commanders began to notice patterns. Every report from surviving crews told the same story. We dived, and they found us. We changed course, and they followed. It was as if they could hear everything, and they could. The Americans were using frequency modulation sonar, or FM sonar, a system that sent out sound waves in patterns and listened for returning echoes. It could map the seafloor, detect mines, and spot submarines miles away. It was nicknamed Hell's Bells by the men who used it, because of the haunting chime it made whenever it detected metal beneath the water. By 1945, American submarines equipped with FM sonar began entering areas Japan thought were completely safe, like the Sea of Japan. Those waters were supposed to be a fortress. The Japanese had planted thick minefields across the entrances, believing no enemy submarine could ever get through. But the Americans had found a way. Using FM sonar, they navigated through the minefields, slipping between explosive traps as if guided by invisible maps. 9 submarines entered the Sea of Japan that summer. They hunted for weeks and sank dozens of Japanese ships without losing a single one of their own. For the Japanese Navy, this was more than a military loss. It was psychological collapse. If even their most protected waters weren't safe, then nowhere was. Technology had rewritten the rules of war. The ocean, once the Empire's shield, had become a trap. Every sound a submarine made could be its last, and as Japan's ships vanished one after another, its sailors began to understand a painful truth. Their enemy didn't just have better weapons. They had changed the very nature of the sea itself. By the summer of 1945, the once proud Japanese submarine fleet had become a shadow of what it used to be. The sailors who once spoke with confidence now whispered when talking about the enemy. They had started to fear the ocean itself, the one place they were supposed to rule. Commander Nobukyo Nambu, one of Japan's most experienced officers, later said something that chilled his interrogators after the war. It wasn't a battle that made me realize Japan had lost. It was the silence of the ocean and the sound of American radios everywhere. For him, the war was over long before Japan surrendered. He had seen the truth beneath the waves, and there was no denying it. Japanese submarines were still patrolling, but they no longer hunted. They hid. Every sonar ping in the distance felt like a warning. Every radar blip above made hearts race. Crews stayed underwater for longer periods, conserving air and fuel, too afraid to surface. The once calm silence inside a submarine was now filled with tension, the quiet breathing of men waiting for sounds of pursuit. Sometimes, they would hear it. the faint hum of aircraft above, or the soft echo of sonar waves bouncing off their hulls. Those sounds meant one thing: the enemy was near. And once detected, there was no escape. The American system worked like clockwork. Planes dropped sonar buoys in patterns, creating invisible listening nets across the ocean. Destroyers circled nearby, ready to drop depth charges the moment a sound was heard. Submarines carried torpedoes that could follow propeller noise automatically. It was no longer a fair fight. It was a hunt. Japan's submariners began to describe the feeling as being trapped inside a glass tank, able to see the vast sea around them, but unable to move without being heard. Even the deepest parts of the ocean could no longer hide them. Some commanders tried to fight back. They changed routes, cut engine power, and even experimented with coating the hulls of their submarines to absorb sonar waves. But nothing worked. Each new patrol seemed to end the same way: silence, then detection, then destruction. Japan's powerful submarines, once the hunters, had become prey to an enemy they could not see and could not outthink. Their confidence, once unshakable, was breaking apart, just like the hulls of their ships. Every time a submarine left port, families gathered to say goodbye, knowing they might never see their sons again. Submarine service, once a symbol of honor, had turned into a death sentence. Over 10,000 Japanese submariners would die before the war ended, more than 70% of all who served beneath the waves. For them, courage was not enough. No matter how skilled or brave they were, technology had already decided the outcome. The ocean that had once carried Japan's empire now carried its defeat. Where submarines once prowled in silence, now the silence itself belonged to someone else. The Americans had turned sound into a weapon, and in doing so, they had taken control of the deep. For Japanese commanders, the message was clear. Their empire had lost not only the war, but the very ocean it was built upon. By the last months of 1945, Japan's empire was crumbling. Cities were in ruins. Ships were gone. Supplies had vanished. But deep below the surface, another kind of collapse had already happened: the emotional and psychological defeat of the Japanese submarine fleet. For years, these men had believed that the ocean belonged to them. They trained harder, sailed farther, and built submarines that could reach the other side of the world. They believed their courage and engineering could overcome any obstacle. But courage cannot silence sonar, and pride cannot outswim a torpedo. The men beneath the waves had learned that lesson the hardest way possible. Commander Nobukyo Nambu, who led one of Japan's largest submarines, the I-401, later spoke about the moment he realized Japan had truly lost the war. It didn't happen in battle. It didn't come from an order or a headline. It came from a sound. While on patrol, his crew intercepted American radio transmissions. At first, he was simply curious. The enemy's voices were calm, casual, and confident. But the more he listened, the more he understood. The Americans weren't desperate. They weren't short on fuel or ammunition. They were relaxed, talking about supply drops, coordinated patrols, and operations across thousands of miles of ocean, all moving with perfect precision. That's when Nambu felt it. The cold realization that Japan had been fighting a machine too large to defeat. He later told his interrogators after the war, "I knew then that Japan had already lost. The Americans had everything, and information, equipment, and time. We had none." The difference between the two nations was overwhelming. While Japan struggled to keep 70 submarines operational, America built more than 300 during the same years. While Japanese shipyards were bombed and short on materials, American factories worked day and night, launching new submarines almost every week. Each American vessel was equipped with radar, sonar, and automated targeting systems, all connected, all reliable. Meanwhile, Japanese submarines often sailed with broken equipment, outdated radios, and limited spare parts. Every American submarine that sank could be replaced in months. Every Japanese submarine that sank took years to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. This was no longer a war between fleets. It was a war between industries, and Japan's could no longer keep up. When the war finally ended, many Japanese submariners didn't celebrate. They didn't even speak. They had already accepted defeat long before the surrender was signed. Those who survived were brought aboard American submarines for questioning. They looked around in silent awe. The technology, the organization, the precision, everything was cleaner, faster, and more advanced than they had imagined. One officer described the experience like walking into the future. He said, "Their submarine was smaller than ours, but everything inside worked. Every switch, every dial, every weapon. It was not arrogance, it was efficiency. The Americans had mastered not just machines, but systems. The Japanese submariners finally understood what had doomed them. It wasn't just a lack of weapons or ships. It was a lack of information, of understanding how far technology had advanced on the other side of the world. They had built submarines like masterpieces, but the Americans built them like tools, thousands of tools that worked together perfectly. Each one part of a network that stretched across oceans, each one connected through radar, sonar, and code-breaking intelligence that told them exactly where their enemies were. The Japanese submariners realized that while they had been fighting a naval war, the Americans had been fighting a technological war, one fought with math, machines, and sound. When Japan's submarines finally surrendered, American officers inspected the mighty I-400 and I-401, enormous vessels longer than destroyers, capable of launching planes from the sea. They were amazed by the engineering but puzzled by their purpose. These submarines, though impressive, had accomplished nothing. They had never fired a shot in combat. Their missions were canceled before they even began. They were the perfect symbols of Japan's struggle, extraordinary craftsmanship trapped in a war, already lost to technology, one American officer said after the inspection. They built giants, but we built systems, and that difference decided the fate of the ocean. When the war ended, the surviving Japanese submariners walked away from the sea in silence. They had witnessed the moment when the ocean changed hands, when sound became a weapon and silence became the enemy. The ocean that once carried Japan's dreams had turned against them. It now belonged to the machines that could hear everything. And beneath the endless waves of the Pacific, the final truth still echoes. The ocean was no longer theirs. The war beneath the waves ended long ago. But the echoes of that time still sleep under the ocean, silent witnesses to a world that learned how to listen before it, learned how to understand. What happened to the Japanese submariners wasn't just a story of defeat. It was a story of realization, of men who discovered too late that courage alone couldn't win against progress. In the end, their struggle showed the world something powerful, that wars are not only fought with weapons, but with innovation, knowledge, and the will to adapt. The Americans turned sound into sight. They transformed silence into strategy, and with that they changed the very meaning of control. The ocean no longer hides secrets. It listens. It remembers. And it tells the story of those who once believed they could rule it forever. For the men aboard the I-52, the sea became both their battlefield and their grave. But their legacy reminds us of one timeless truth. In war, the greatest weapon isn't power. It's understanding. If you found this story fascinating, imagine how many more are still hidden beneath the waves. Untold stories of courage, innovation, and the cost of change. Make sure to subscribe for more deep cinematic stories from history. And remember, behind every silent ocean lies an echo of the past, waiting to be heard.